Hey, SoulHub family, welcome to this week's dynamic class where we are going to be discussing all things consciousness. So it's a very cool subject. Tom here is an expert in the science of consciousness. So this week I'm going to be interviewing him about that. And we're going to be discussing everything from what it is and, is it a product of the brain? Is it something else? Is there scientific proof that consciousness exists? And then, of course, more importantly, what it can actually mean for your life to understand these things on a practical basis, how that can transform you, which is always the key and is always something that we're very interested in doing. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So, Tom, the first question I have for you, and this is something probably on a lot of people's minds, we talk a lot about consciousness. I know I do a lot when I'm talking about spiritual awakening, and I'm always telling people that you are not this body, you are consciousness, you are consciousness itself. But the question that comes up is, what is it? How do you define it? Can you even define what consciousness is?
Yeah, so maybe you can't define exactly, like in an absolute sense, what it is, but you can definitely describe it. So you can, it's like in Zen, these Zen koans. A lot of them, it's you arrived at a higher understanding through the negation of what you do understand. So it leaves this hole around what actually is, even though if you can't actually, get it right there at the center, you kind of know everything else around it. So as far as consciousness goes, I think the simplest absolute answer would be that consciousness is everything. It is everything. Look around you. I mean, your body, your environment, this computer screen, the screen that you're looking at, it is all ultimately at the very fundamental level consciousness. And the way to think of it, it's kind of like being in a dream, where if you see a road, a car, a tree, a person, it's all part of your own consciousness in the case of your nightly dreams. But when you're awake in this world, it's not as simple, but it's pretty close in the sense that we are participating in the conscious projection of something that's greater than our own individual consciousness. So you can think of consciousness as the ocean, and we ourselves are more like the individual waves or whirlpools or the water currents within the ocean, right? So there's individuality, which is you and me, in the sense that you perceive your perspective, I perceive my perspective. We both have free will to a certain extent. We are both experiencing things in a very unique way. But at the same time, we are also projections or different instances of the one same universal consciousness that is behind our own awareness, and that is behind the entire environment that we exist within. So when you think about consciousness, you also have to think about the absolute versus the relative level of consciousness. Because the absolute is simply that there is only one consciousness and everything is part of it. Everything's an expression of it. But on a relative scale, as I said, we are also individual units of consciousness within the greater field that experience our own path through it. Okay. And so from the relative perspective, you can think of it in terms of what is the difference between a living being like you or me or your pet or the tree outside versus a simple machine or a robot or like a
rock, right?
Yeah, or a rock or some character in a video game, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the fundamental difference? And outwardly, they can act pretty similar, but we're not talking about outward. We're talking about inward. What is the inward difference between the two? And the difference is that consciousness is the only thing that's capable of perceiving. Okay, that's one example. It's the only thing capable of experiencing something. It is intelligent. It has free will. It creates. If you think about like a machine that makes cookies, is it creating cookies? Not really. All it is doing it's just a complicated set of dominoes programmed to fall one after the other. From the ingredients that you put into it, the way it was machined, the electricity going through it, and it spits out cookies. And there are a lot of scientists who want to say that we as humans are no different from that machine. They believe that there is no such thing as consciousness other than an effect of the machinery of the universe. That there is no soul, there's no true mind. Everything is just matter, space, energy, and time. And
okay, let me pause you here because
sure.
this is actually something that can get confusing for people. So you started out saying consciousness is everything, right? Which is true on one level. And now you're saying, well, a machine isn't actually conscious the way, for instance, a human being is. And that scientists who say that consciousness is just the product essentially of the brain are saying that they could produce the same type essentially of consciousness through artificial intelligence, let's say, because it's just a mechanical process. So I guess the question to people would be, so what is still kind of a little deeper, what is consciousness? If everything is consciousness, that means even a machine, even a rock is consciousness because there's nothing else. It's like in the dream, when you're dreaming at night, everything is still an expression of your mind. So if you're saying here everything is consciousness, even in the whole universe, how do we differentiate that and the idea that, for instance, a machine is not conscious like a human being? So maybe we need a different kind of terminology for that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a difference between consciousness and being conscious.
Yeah.
Okay, so consciousness, we're talking about a thing, we're talking about an actuality, the essence of something. And being conscious is simply it's a functional description of how much consciousness and its true expression of free will, creativity, intelligence, everything like that is expressed in that particular form within this greater illusion.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just like in your nightly dreams, you have a dream character who seems very animated, and then you have the dream rock, which just sits there. You're not even looking at it. It's not even doing anything. Okay, and yet both are ultimately woven from the fabric of your own consciousness. Okay, but functionally they're quite different. And so that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about how within this entire field of consciousness and everything that's within it, you, me, and the environment and physical objects, we all have different levels of expression of consciousness. And that defines the difference between the function of one thing and the function of another.
Sure.
Right. So
one other question that might help clarify things for people. What about when people say, for instance, everything is just energy? Can you define consciousness as energy? Because that's something, energy is at least something people can formulate in their mind and have some idea of what that is.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah. So even if you go by the physics definition of energy, which is something that is capable of affecting change or capable of doing work, something that has vibration and amplitude. Okay, like light. Light is energy. You know, it has vibration, has amplitude, and it makes things happen. Okay, you can say therefore that consciousness is a kind of energy, or actually, the more appropriate thing to say would be that what physics calls energy is one manifestation of consciousness. Okay, and just as energy from a wall socket can boil water or cook your food, the energy that we call consciousness can animate living things and make us capable of affecting each other, you know, loving each other, creating things, making life happen. And it's also capable of sustaining this very physical reality that we're in. Okay.
Yeah. So it's basically like so consciousness itself is like a building block. It is the very fabric of everything in existence. And yet it has different ways of manifesting that, for instance, in the human being, it's a very animated form of consciousness. So that's why we say we are conscious. Where in a rock, it's not so animated, although at the intrinsic level, still made of the same stuff.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And one of my favorite metaphors for that is if you think of a metal lampshade and with little holes pricked in it, and if you look at all the different holes, they all look like different points of light. But all they are doing is they are revealing the one central light, you know, at the center of the lamp. Okay. And some of these holes may be bigger than others. They might have different shapes. You might even have different filters in them that make different colors, but it's all the same light. Okay. And so the same thing with our reality here, where we have different beings, different, like this phone, for example. It's made of matter. It's made of energy. And is it consciousness? At the very root, it is consciousness. But is it conscious? Maybe only at a very, very low level, because this thing isn't programmed, isn't sensitive enough, isn't functional enough to express consciousness in its most fulfilling and true and alive kind of way.
Okay. That's, I think that, you know, it's a very tough subject to describe, but I think that should paint a picture to people, because often people have this idea in their mind that, you know, like for instance, because I am conscious, because I have free will, that means I am consciousness, but something else, for instance, is just inanimate and it's not. Where we're saying here, it's all one thing expressing itself in infinitely different ways, different levels of vibration, of free will, of conscious energy, and so forth. But it's still all, we can't even call it one being, but maybe a beingness, let's say. So that could help.
Yeah.
All right. So then let's get back to something you were talking about, which is how do we know that consciousness is not just a product of physical matter? Because there are many scientists that try to claim that it's all just created by the brain, like being conscious as a human being is just a function of the brain. It's a completely mechanical process. There's no such thing as a soul or spirit or that underlying fabric of consciousness as we were just defining it, which has this divine element to it, let's just say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of those philosophical questions that's been debated for centuries, you know, and it hasn't really had a resolution in academia just because there are so many stubborn people who don't want to go deep enough at the very root of what's going on. But, you know, the most convincing argument, which is the one that I subscribe to, goes something like this. So if you think of the brain as if your brain were a machine, okay, if your body were nothing more than a machine, then all it is different pieces and parts operating by the laws of physics, okay? And what physics tries to do is it tries to predict what something is going to do next based on what it's like and what laws it follows, okay? So if you know those things, you can predict everything it's going to do into the future. So what they're trying to say is that the brain is a complicated machine, and that if you knew everything about the molecules that make it up, you know, the neurons and everything, what the person went through, you'd be able to predict everything that person would do next. So that's something that they call determinism. And determinism is kind of like it's the idea of cause and effect, that everything that happens in existence is nothing but a big line of dominoes, one pushing the next one, pushing the next one, pushing the next one without any surprises, you know, just one future, you know, to one track. Well, here's the thing though. The brain itself operates not only by the laws of psychology, but if you go beneath psychology, you go to the level of biology. Beneath biology is chemistry. Beneath that is physics. And eventually you end up where the neurons are, and neurons are made of atoms and subatomic particles, right? When you get that deep into the level of, you know, what we call reality, which is just a layer of this illusion. When you get that deep though, scientists find that they cannot predict what's going to happen next. Because quantum particles, and we're talking about electrons, atoms, molecules, things like that, these particles, they jitter about, they move, they behave in ways that cannot be calculated. And physicists have actually proven that they cannot be calculated. So it's not like they don't know it can't be. They actually worked out the math that says, no, you cannot physically predict what this thing will do next. So then the question is, what is making these electrons, these subatomic particles, move in that certain way? And physics says, well, we don't know, but all we know is that it's nothing physical. So what does that leave? The metaphysical. So something metaphysical is affecting matter at a very small, like deep quantum level. And
define metaphysical for anyone who doesn't understand that term.
All right, so physical is something that you can measure. You can feel it, taste it, touch it. You can use instruments like, you know, scientists have little electron microscopes that can actually peer down into the level of the molecule and see the electron clouds, you know, going around molecules, right? So that's physical. Metaphysical means that it's something beyond the physical. It has to do with what I'm about to say, which is consciousness. Consciousness is the only thing left once you've eliminated all the other possibilities that physicists have eliminated for what could be causing these atoms to behave the way that they do. Now, once you realize that the human brain itself depends on these little quantum fluctuations to have certain thoughts, to have certain neural activities, to, you know, things that give rise to what we, you know, perceive as emotions and feelings and things like that, then what that ultimately means is that human consciousness, or what we perceive as our own mind and our own activities, it comes from a level of reality that is being influenced by something beyond physicality itself. And that is consciousness. So in a way, you can almost say that the brain is simultaneously a quantum computer. In other words, it's a computer that operates by the weird laws of quantum physics, and is also a quantum antenna in the sense that it can pick up on things that are beyond physicality itself. So consciousness, the soul, the spirit, things like that.
So would it be fair to say that what physicists call consciousness, this mysterious realm completely beyond the physical that seems to be actually directly influenced in the physical in unpredictable ways, is the same as what spiritual people would call spirit, because it's something completely beyond the physical.
Yeah, essentially. And so the thing about that is it kind of brings up the question about where does life actually begin? Okay. Mm-hmm. Because I mean, even people who are sensitive to energies, and I'm talking about, you know, clairvoyance and such, they can sense that rocks have a basic life force energy, you know, sure. and of course plants do, and everything else does as well. Mm-hmm. But living beings that are more complex, whether it's animals or humans, they definitely have a stronger, more complex, subtle energy field. Okay, mm-hmm. And we'll get more into subtle energy in a bit because that's a pretty important topic. Yeah. But as far as like where does life begin? We were talking about the human brain just now and how it's very sensitive to consciousness, which is outside physicality, which then influences things at a very deep quantum level, which then scales up through the brain into me moving my hand or talking. Mm-hmm. Okay, mm-hmm. And but here's the thing, though: the human brain itself isn't the sole source of conscious behavior, because even bacteria and plants exhibit life. Okay. Sure. And they don't have brains necessarily. Like there's a lot of bacteria that don't even have a nucleus. So, but they're still alive. So there are structures within these living things. Some call them microtubules, which is I mean, we don't have to go there, but it's a complicated subject. But mm-hmm. Long story short, that there are these microstructures within living cells that they're almost like, I mean, those are the quantum antennas that I was talking about. They're basically these really tiny filaments that are hollow, and they're composed of particles called dimers that wrap around them. And these things are sensitive. They're very sensitive to quantum events. And so when consciousness or some life force energy field intends something, these things respond to it, which makes a microtubule change in a certain way. And then the cell itself, behaves in a certain way. And our neurons are made of these things. And every cell in our body is made of these microtubules. So those are the antennas through which consciousness ultimately filters into this physical illusion here. And when I'm talking about the difference between the two, of course, remembering that it's just one aspect of consciousness as a whole interacting with another aspect of consciousness, which is physical reality. But within us, the human brain is that interface mechanism. Okay. But in order for it to do so, it needs something between spirit, which is completely outside physicality, and the physical body, which is completely within physical reality. So between those two extremes, there has to be some sort of an intermediary layer.
A bridge, basically, something that bridges the spirit, the complete other realm of pure consciousness with the manifestation of consciousness in this physical illusion, as we call it. Yes. And the reason, by the way, we call it an illusion is simply because it seems like it's just a bunch of physical stuff, but at the core, it's all consciousness. It's all one thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So there has to be an intermediary interface between the two, a bridge. And that is what a lot of people call subtle energy or the aura or the soul. And there's a lot we can discuss about that.
Okay, so since you mentioned that, let's jump right into it. Many people probably, unless they're into this subject deeply, don't know what subtle energy is per se, but a lot of people have heard of the aura. They say, oh, this person has a really nice aura, right? I mean, it's become kind of a common term. And obviously, everyone knows that at some level, unless you're purely scientific, and which you probably wouldn't be in this community if you were, people believe that there's a soul behind, this body. So are subtle energy and the soul and aura the same thing? Are they different manifestations of a similar thing? How do you explain all this?
Yeah, so it all depends on how you define these different things, because what one person calls the soul and spirit, another person calls the spirit and the soul. Okay. Now, it used to be that before the 1900s, ever since the Renaissance, really, there was this thing called the fourfold conception of the human being, which was mind, body, spirit, and soul. Okay. So it wasn't just that, you have a physical body and the rest, which was, soul. They actually divided it into four different things. Okay. And so why did they say spirit and soul? Why didn't they just say one thing? Well, it's because, as I mentioned, spirit is the ultimate ultimate thing. I mean, that when you talked about just absolute consciousness, that's what spirit is. Okay. It's at the very tippy top of what
So
makes
it's the
us.
root cause. It's like that mysterious realm that's causing everything else, let's just say.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
fine.
Okay. And between that and here in the physical world, there is that bridge in between. And that would be, that's what you could call the soul. So the soul is the interface between spirit and the body. And then the mind is sort of it's in the middle. It's what the mind is, which is a good question to get into. The mind is actually the spirit filtering through the programming and biology of the human brain. Okay. So earlier, when I mentioned how the human brain is not only a quantum antenna, but also a quantum computer, the reason why I say computer, as you know, is because we are programmable, right? We come into this world as babies, and it takes a whole lifetime of socialization and learning and schooling and everything like that to become what we are. So we didn't come here complete. And we also didn't come here as completely blank slates either, due to many reasons. But the fact that we are programmable means that a part of us functions as a program. So we do have a computer within our heads. And that's what a lot of people call the ego or the intellect or the human mind. And the mind, it's what allows us to interact with this world in a smooth, socialized kind of way. Like if you had no mind or no ego right now, and you weren't really connected to your true spiritual self either, you'd have a very difficult time surviving, just because you wouldn't. It's like going diving without a dive suit, or
Sure.
you know what I mean. So the mind is this programmed avatar within us that allows us to interact with this environment that we're in.
Okay. So what about the soul and subtle energy, and how does that work as the bridge between spirit and the physical?
Okay. So the soul, as what a lot of mystics would call the etheric body or the astral body, and those are two different things. And what that is it's a energetic scaffolding that your physical body, like your physical cells and DNA and everything like that, they take their commands ultimately from this other realm where you would have what these mystics call etheric energy or subtle energy. And so what the spirit does, like for example, if you want to do something in life or even just move your body, okay, there's an intention that comes from your spirit, your true consciousness in another higher dimension. And it affects first the subtle energy fields that comprise your body's solar aura. And that energy field then in turn is what affects your cells and your neurons and your brain. And that's what makes your body move. Okay, that's what makes you live. So the soul then is necessary for the spirit to operate the body and to make things happen in life. And you asked about the aura, okay? So a person.
Hold up. Can I just ask one thing to clarify? Because I think this is a subject of deep confusion, just because people use so many different terms. And so the question is, when you say the spirit, let's say, intends something, and then it needs kind of the soul, which is this, let's just call it this etheric energy field that then influences the body. When you say spirit on that level intends something, are you talking about, because people are going to think, well, is this my spirit? Like, for instance, let's assume I think of myself as this person, have a spirit or have a soul, and which will continue to live beyond the body. But people will usually very much identify that spirit as essentially a formless personality still, or identity, as because that's how we think of ourselves. We think of as this separate thing. So fine, I die, I rise out of my body, and I'm still going to go I. So it's still all this thought of this, one being separate from the rest. So when you're saying spirit, are you talking about the complete undifferentiated spirit? Are you talking about an individualized portion of consciousness? And then how is that different from the soul? So just to kind of get a little deeper into that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so ultimately, right, if you look at it from an absolute perspective, everything is being operated by consciousness in an absolute sense, right? But of course, as we talked about earlier, consciousness is differentiated into individualized forms, okay? And one of those forms, I guess you could call it your own higher self, your own spirit. And, and I mean, this all comes down to your preference for how you define these things.
Sure.
Okay?
And that's why I just wanted to be clear on definitions so there's no confusion.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So let's just go through the definitions then.
Yeah.
So in the very top ultimate absolute sense, you have consciousness, universal, which is what makes up everything.
Just one thing, one beingness. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, one beingness behind both what we perceive as physical reality and everything that lives.
Non-physical.
Okay.
Sure. Okay. Fine.
And then within that entire field, there is individual expressions of consciousness, the highest of which you could call the higher self or spirit. And that forms the very core of you as an individual being having its own journey through this grand journey of spiritual self-discovery. Okay. So
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's the core that remains constant, that remains always there and always remains plugged into that greater, higher absolute consciousness.
Okay, so if we were to look at that greater absolute consciousness that you're talking about, that's it. Just to assume as a giant body, just for an analogy, the spirit are like the cells of that body. So, for instance, I have a spirit, you have a spirit. That is like a cell of the giant body of consciousness formed from the same fabric as consciousness. That stays in a way constant, but then can have many different expressions as different bodies through different souls. Would that be a good way to explain it? Okay.
Yeah. And one of the classic ways that it's explained in mystical research is that prior to being born, a spirit will form out of the etheric and astral energy fields a soul. And the soul then becomes its interface to a particular body. Okay. So the soul is it's like something being cast into a mold. So it takes on the shape of what it's supposed to be, and that shape happens to be the physical body that a person is going to incarnate into. Okay, so consciousness at the very top, then spirit being the individualized expression of that, and then spirit gathers a soul to animate the individual body that it's going to project a part of itself into to experience this life. And then the part of it that projects into the physical brain and works through its programming, its ego, its intellect, is what you and I recognize as our everyday level of consciousness. So when you turn within and you notice your own self-awareness, what you're noticing that light of that pinprick on the lampshade, the light that comes from that central bulb, in the lamp shining through. So that's the light of your consciousness coming through. But of course, it's being restricted and filtered down by your own biology and because think about it, what does your body do? Your body kind of locks you into using mostly your five senses. So it filters out pretty much all reality except for what you can perceive through your five senses in this space, in this time, and with the particular thoughts and beliefs and, history that you have. So that's how we get from the ultimate absolute level down to this everyday human level. So, you can tell that as beings, we're a complicated composite of different layers, of the ultimate white light filtering down into different colors and shapes and patterns.
So it is literally a filtering process from ultimate reality down to a subsection of that, which is spirit, down to spirit one to experience itself as, for instance, a human being in this realm, which then it needs a soul to interface with. So it's kind of like levels down.
Yeah. And if it seems kind of complicated or confusing, it's simple if you just realize that everything is consciousness. That's the one thing that we should not forget. No matter how complicated all the different layers, like some of these mystics that get into the different like 12 dozen, 30 different layers to the human being, but it's not really necessary. No. You got the body, you got the ego, intellect, mind. You've got this energy field that interfaces, which we can call the soul. And then you've got the ultimate spirit, which is the core of our individuality. That's pretty much all it comes down to as far as.
Yeah. Exactly. And so then talking about this auric field or the soul, so would you define essentially the soul as the same thing as the aura and subtle energy that they talk about in the East?
Yes, exactly. Well, it depends, right? Because if you hold your hand up to someone and you're sensitive and you feel their energy field, or maybe you're clairvoyant and you can actually see their aura, you're picking up on the outer expression or the part of their energy field that penetrates beyond the skin. Okay. But yeah, it is all subtle energy, and subtle energy has different grades, just as energy in physics has different forms, whether it's temperature, electricity, or whatever. But subtle energy has different aspects to it. But the whole point behind it is that it animates things and it influences physical matter, and that's how consciousness can influence physical matter.
Okay, which brings up two questions for me. One is, first of all, is there actually any scientific evidence that subtle energy field exists? And then two, is there actually any evidence that consciousness or this energy field, I don't want to use the word consciousness anymore because now we're defining as that ultimate reality, but let's just say the subtle energy field or the soul level, still formless, obviously beyond the physical, can affect physical matter. So let's start with the first one. Is there actually scientific evidence for this subtle energy field that is not visible with the human eye unless you happen to be clairvoyant or something, but that is very much is what is influencing us?
Yeah, for example, if you just talk strictly about consciousness, I mean, this is what we're talking about consciousness, whether it can affect physical matter or not, okay? Because in order for it to do so, it needs a subtle energy field. But
Sure.
even that question alone about whether consciousness can affect physical matter, yeah, there's so much. It's amazing the level of evidence that's out there. I mean, for example, Dr. Dean Radin, who's the chief scientist at the Institute for Noetic Sciences, in 2016, he released the results of a series of experiments that he did. And these were intensive, amazingly intensive experiments. He did thousands of tests and trials to see whether conscious intention, in other words, a meditator just sitting there and focusing his or her intention on a quantum experiment to see whether consciousness could influence the behavior of little quantum particles, whether it's photons or electrons, and they had really good instrumentation for detecting it. And so after these thousands of trials, when he ran the numbers on it, he came to basically 99.9999% certainty that consciousness can affect quantum events without any sort of physical mechanism in between. It's not like the person his body heat was, affecting the experiment or anything like that, right? It was just pure
controlled for those things. So it was just basically pure intention of mind. So essentially mind over matter is the way most people would understand.
Yeah, right. And it wasn't just one type of experiment. It was, many. It was like over a dozen, and they even used people from around the world to test for different distance effects, everything like that. And it pretty much put the nail in the coffin for the question about whether consciousness can influence matter. Okay, so that's one example. And then you've got other cool examples like, Masaru Emoto, the Japanese researcher who took photos of, ice crystals and found out how different words or vibrational energies behind conscious intentions and emotions can influence the shape of these water crystals. I mean, most people know Masaru Emoto, but he's another interesting example of how consciousness can affect physical matter itself. Okay, and you've got others like Dr. William Tiller, who did experiments on the acidity of water, which fluctuates very slightly at room temperature. But he was able to measure that and found out that when you have meditators focusing on it, they're able to actually affect the pH, the acidity of water, just using their conscious intention. Okay, so that's chemical. It's like chemistry proof right there, versus Dr. Dean Radin, who was doing quantum proof. So it doesn't matter we're looking at that or chemistry or all these different sciences. Each one of them has their own example. Okay.
So there's been proof from every single one of the fields of science that just pure conscious intention affects matter, which can only be possible if it is actually part of the same fabric. If physical matter was actually completely separate from what we are in truth, it would basically be impossible to alter in any way, right? Unless there was some kind of sort of connection. And
yes, exactly. Yes.
Way.
Yeah. So, one part of this collective dream we call reality is influencing another part of this collective dream called reality. But it's not doing it directly through the dream itself. It's doing it through the underlying reality that connects everything within that dream, the underlying field of absolute consciousness. And, even in the field of statistics, I read a really good page recently, which got into something that you're familiar with called the Maharishi Effect. Mm-hmm. And, that's where you have mass meditations taking place in various cities or at various times. And they were able to influence, and they proved that they were able to influence, as you know, the crime rates within those cities or within the entire world. And they did so many of these studies proving...
there's been many of them.
Yeah. I mean, they started in the 70s, but they've been continuing for a long time, and each one shows in each case that consciousness, mass meditation, conscious intention can affect the world at large, right? So it's not just quantum particles, it's not just pH of water. We're talking about actual behavior of the world at large being influenced by consciousness.
Yeah, which is huge, and I want to later get into the kind of the practical benefits of this, but obviously that is something that could be key to our world. So we can discuss that a little more. But first, I want to kind of still around this idea of this. So there's a lot of scientific proof that just pure conscious intention can affect matter, chemistry, physical events, all these different things. What about any actual proof of the subtle energy field existing? Because people talk about an aura, right? Oh, this person has but is it actually a real thing that exists, or is it just this intuition that people feel?
Yeah, for example, one of the earliest, one of the coolest examples, I guess, would be Kirlian photography. It's pronounced Kirlian, but it's spelled Kirlian, Kirlian photography. Okay. And what they do there is they take an object, whether it's your hand or a leaf or juice or something like that, and they put it on a photographic film plate. Put it on there, and then they pump high voltage electricity through it and watch what kind of sparks come out. And the question would be, well, people would be wondering, okay, how can that possibly show evidence of the soul? Well, they found that the more living it was, the more life force it has, or in the case of a person, the healthier they were, the stronger the emissions of the sparks. In other words, the brighter the image that was recorded on this photographic film. And people wonder, well, what is the physics behind that? Why would the sparks be stronger in the case of a stronger aura or a stronger energy field? And the reason is because electricity likes to take the path of least resistance through space. Okay, and space itself, according to scientific belief, is constant in its properties everywhere. It's just constant. But what these Kirlian photography experiments showed is that life force energy field, subtle energy, whatever you want to call it, it's capable of actually affecting space itself, like its actual properties. The speed of light through it, how strong gravity is through it, how easily electricity can flow through it. So there's something. So people think of space as empty, but of course it's not actually empty. It's just like if you look at an empty web page, if you were to look at the source code behind it, there actually is a lot of code going on to make that page even appear. Okay, so it's just like that, right? So we got this empty space, and underneath it, there's a subtle energy that has a lot of stuff going on in it. And they found that stuff can be modified by life force energy itself. Okay, so if you're a really healthy person, you can have a lot of sparks coming off when you do this technique. Okay, so that's one example. Another example would be the field of biophotons. And what biophotons are, they're actually they're laser-like emissions of light given off by your cells. And actually cells in your body, they use these little beams of light, these little photons, to communicate with each other, to convey information like how healthy one cell is, how sick another cell is. So when you have all these sick cells, for example, giving off biophotons of sickness, it actually causes other cells that receive that light to also get sick because it's a conveyance of information. But what they found was that these biophotons correlate very closely with what Kirlian photographs and even clairvoyance see about a particular thing that they're examining. Okay, so biophotons themselves are not the aura, but they are they're a side effect of the aura. It's just like when you got like a tornado or dust devil. The dust itself isn't the wind, right? But it gives away the presence of the wind. So likewise, these biophotons are, they give away the presence of a life force energy field. Okay, and then you can get into more interesting fringy type evidence like astral projection, out of body experiences, which they've had a lot of scientific studies done on those, showing that it is possible to take your consciousness within your soul, your subtle energy field, and leave your physical body and move around, go somewhere else, look at things, get information about it, and then come back, and then they report it to the scientists, and they can verify that, I mean, you actually were there, you actually saw things. And likewise, where they do these experiments, when you leave your body, if you go into a room that has, let's say, a pet, a cat or something, they can react to your they can react.
Astral body.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, and that's within a scientific setting, but we know that even just from our own lives. Anyone who has a cat or a dog knows that sometimes they see things
something that you don't see, and they're clearly reacting to something that we can't perceive.
Mhm.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is this subtle energy field that has been shown by these scientific studies to react in different ways based on who's being studied, whether it's a human or let's say a plant or something, shows the proof that there's something beyond the physical based on what the experiment is being done on. So I guess the question is, does that mean only humans have souls, or what about plants? What about a rock? Like, have they done, does everything have an auric field? Because essentially everything would have to have that counterpart of spirit at the
Mhm.
other end, and something to interface with the physical, and then the spirit wanting to experience itself, let's say, as a rock versus as a human. So would you call that still a soul, or is that just a more, I guess, more basic form of an energy field that's not, wouldn't be defined as a soul? So I guess what I'm trying to get at is what makes the definition called a soul
Mhm.
versus something else. Is it free will? What would you say it is?
Yeah, it's a little bit of everything. So I think that the one of the ways to understand it is that it's just like, well, if you start at, for example, you take the human being, okay, someone who's extremely healthy, they're going to have a very strong subtle energy field. Clairvoyance going to be able to pick up, that they have this very, very strong vitality about them. But then when they get sick, the field starts to contract. It gets darker. It's not as strong anymore. And if the person passes away, what's left? Well, then most of those energetic radiations that the clairvoyant is picking up on, they're going to fade away, or they're going to actually move, because now the person's out of body after the body has expired. Okay, so that's gone. So all that's left then is just the biological body itself, the physical body. And some cells and some bacteria are still alive, so it's still going to have warmth. It's still going to have some glow to it. But what you're talking about there is you're talking about it simply reducing to the energy field that all matter has, because that's what the body ultimately becomes. Ashes to
Just
ashes,
matter.
dust to dust, it becomes matter again. And matter does have, it has to have, and it does have a very basic energy field. Okay. And if you want to call that the soul or not, I think it gets down to if you want to define the soul as a kind of energy or as a particular form. Okay. Because like localized form. So if you want, it's just like when we say water, do we mean a body of water, or do we mean water, the molecule, right?
Yeah.
It's like, one's universal and one's localized.
Mm-hmm.
But even amongst matter and minerals, we have different kinds or different qualities of energy fields. And that's why sensitive people are attracted to crystal work or stone work, certain stones or crystals having certain properties. And they talk about, for example, quartz crystals and other kinds of crystals, even salt, having an effect on your subtle energy field. Okay. Like some people, for example, they feel they have negative energies in their home or around themselves. You can use sea salt to, attract that negative energy into it, and then you can throw it away or flush it, and it gets rid of that energy. So there's a very strong relation between the soul, subtle energy, and certain kinds of physical substances that have a very strong magnetic attraction to those things. Okay. One of those substances is water. Water is very attractive of subtle energy fields, more so than others. Okay. Water. Iron is another thing. Okay. So there's this lore in certain traditions where if you want to protect yourself against certain negative spirits, you put a piece of iron under your pillow or behind your bed, like a horseshoe, for example. And, that'll keep a lot of these spirits away, because, these spirits, or I don't want to say spirits, but these entities, they don't want to have their energy sapped by this magnetic pull of this piece of iron, for example. And
so what you're saying is a lot of these myths that we hear about, a lot of this kind of cultural, these beliefs have actually some basis in actual real science based on subtle energy fields and the life force of different energy fields and how they attract or repel each other.
Yeah, and some cultures have turned it into a meticulous science. For example, the Eastern traditions, the martial art practice of Qigong, for example.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of martial arts, they depend on this chi flow that they're manipulating as they're doing their moves, or even in actual physical combat. They're also combating at the subtle energy level, you know, like one combatant's soul affecting the soul of the other combatant. So
Yeah,
it's
you
very,
hear them about talking that they're just both standing still, and yet they can feel the other's intention without any physical movement. They know if the other's mind is still or fluctuating. So what you're saying here is they're actually experiencing each other's subtle energy fields, which, because they can do this at such high levels, and it's clear they show actually they can do things that seem impossible, that's actually more proof that there's something beyond the physical that's interacting. You could say they're essentially dealing with each other on a soul to soul level, and whoever has more mastery over connecting with that is kind of the greater martial artist in that case.
yeah. So no matter where you look, you tend to eventually stumble into evidence of subtle energy. Like, for example, when I mentioned certain substances being attractive of subtle energy, I mentioned water, iron, another one is salt. Well, what is blood made of? Water, iron, you know, certain salty minerals. And that's because blood itself is it's a very strong communicator of subtle energy, and it has to be in order for us to live, right? I mean, it conveys not only oxygen and nutrients, but also subtle energy. So we've got subtle energy coursing through our bodies, through our veins. And you know, and that leads to the other issue of cool subject of meridians and chakras and you know, things like that. And you know, those came about in the Oriental traditions because over the centuries, you know, thousands of years ago, and you know, lots of experiments, there were clairvoyants who were able to see these energy fields and map them out on the body, and they knew how to manipulate them to achieve certain healing effects, for example.
So that's why we have all these pictures of the 7 chakras, all with different colors, you know, on the system.
And you know, also all the acupuncture charts showing, you know, hundreds of points all over the body and what they do. So that's a high level of occult medicine, I guess you could call it, occult biology, and that, you know, goes way beyond us just sensing, oh, I feel bad vibes from that person, but it's all part of the same thing. You know, it's all part of the same thing.
So you're essentially, when you feel bad vibes from a person, or even good vibes, you're essentially, your subtle energy field is sensing theirs, and then you just think, oh, I don't know why I feel like this, but it's actually something scientific is happening, and then someone who's, let's say, a spiritual will just say, oh, I can sense their aura. But there's actually real science proving all this stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, our subtle energy field is not only confined within our physical bodies to operate it. Like some people, they actually put out a lot of subtle energy into their environment, and so their entire home, you know, or wherever they stay, gets saturated with that energy, for good or for bad, depending, right? Yeah. So that's why some places, you have places that just feel really icky, like you don't want to go in there, you know. And not just homes, but entire cities. You know, like I noticed this interesting thing where you can be driving through the countryside, and when you approach a certain city, there's a moment where you hit a wall of energy that kind of is characteristic of the average subtle energy vibrations of the people that live in that town. You know, and
I've noticed that too in certain places. You just feel like when you're there. In some places, well, especially when you're out in nature, a lot of times that's the reason I feel so peaceful, is probably because there isn't some lower consciousness or lower subtle energy fields of humans there bringing it down, right?
Yeah, so that's why it's so important for your own home to try to create an atmosphere of positive energy. And the way one way you do that is simply by being more careful about what thoughts and feelings you hold all day long, because those vibrations don't only affect your body, you know, in terms of your health and things like that, but also it imprints on your environment. Like all the matter around you, the air molecules, everything like that, it gets saturated with your own subtle energy vibrations. And you know, so in the case of someone who has very positive energies, the home just feels amazing, right? It feels so peaceful, so clear, and people just want to go there and relax and lie down. So a lot of these temples, you know, they're environments that help people with their spiritual practice by having a very hygienic, a very clean, very high vibrational, subtle energy environment within that temple. You know, so as soon as you step in there, you can just feel what it's like, you know.
So what you're saying is that the subtle energy field is doesn't just fluctuate in its intensity based on physical health, but also based on emotional, psychological health. So the thoughts and the feelings that you're allowing, or you're in, either you're making bigger and more because you're focusing on them, or so it's basically a composite of things that is affecting this energy field, which again can be called the soul. So it's not like this static thing. It's constantly changing and either evolving or staying kind of at a lower level of consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sometimes you can have these subtle energy fields that don't come necessarily, or they're not anchored to a particular person. It's just it's like natural subtle energy fields. Okay, so that's why certain sites around the world are considered healing sites, whether it's healing springs or it's a place where spiritual temples and churches have been built on over eons, right? And then you have other places that are considered cursed because whatever goes on there, it's just not good. And that's because, certain subtle energy fields are dark and contractive and, they carry kind of like negative vibrations. So there's this whole other realm or level to existence. It's beyond the physical, obviously. And, but beneath the absolute spiritual level too. It's just like this weird in between place and that's where a lot of interesting thing happens. Things
so
happen.
A lot of weird stuff happen on that bridge, basically.
Yeah, it's everything under the hood. Take any electronic device and you open it up and you see circuit boards and little pieces and parts and electricity coursing through it. Well, it's the same with reality, right? I mean, everything we're looking at right now is only the surface veneer, the paint. But underneath physicality, there's this etheric, astral, soul energy, subtle energy field that projects it all, that makes it all happen, that influences it all. And then the key to realize is that even within your own body, you have the subtle energy field, and your core consciousness, your spirit, your higher self, the thoughts and feelings that you have, they can influence that for better or for worse, depending on what patterns you hold within your everyday conscious activity.
Yeah, which brings us kind of to the whole practical aspect of this. So I wanted to discuss the science with you to kind of help bridge science and spirituality. Because a lot of time we hear about all these different concepts like auras and chakras and spirit and soul and all these different types of things, and even, negative entities and all this stuff. And sometimes we dismiss it as just kind of myths, and sometimes we really believe in it, but we don't know why. And, so it's kind of like there's a science behind all of it. And it bridges these things to show that it's not just some mythical thing. There's a reality behind all this, and it actually has to do with the quantum reality of the fabric of consciousness. And because the physical is not as it seems, that's why we call it an illusion of physicality. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist on this level, of course, but there's much more going on behind the surface. So then, which brings me to practical applications of this knowledge. So it's good to understand science and to give proof to all these things. That allows us essentially to be able to perceive it as more credible and to have some belief in it. But at the end, to me, that ends up being just knowledge unless we can do something with it, right? And so you've already started to touch upon that when you were talking about how knowing that your subtle energy field actually doesn't just affect you, it affects your entire home, it affects everything in it, other people. So the question is, are there other practical applications or benefits of knowing these things in your life? And do you have any advice on certain things that people can do to put this knowledge to use?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are different, so we talked about different expressions or different levels of consciousness or different levels within our being, right? And each one of those has different practical applications to it. So if we start at the very top, for example, at the very top, we're talking about the unity of consciousness. So when you just, when you sense your awareness in the moment, if you just close your eyes and you just sense your own presence, your own self-awareness, what you're doing there is you're sensing that light that is common to all that lives. Everything living has that light. Each one is a pinpoint in that lampshade shining its own light, but it's all one light. Okay, and if you focus on that feeling of life within yourself, and you notice that life within all other living things, whether it's a person or an animal that you see, or even the plants, even physical matter itself. If you can look at it and sense that it's all one consciousness shining through everything, just everything has this light shining through it, that is a really good practice for grounding yourself in a higher, more absolute reality versus this relative self, where you're thinking about your bills and what you can eat today and all that kind of stuff. So it's good to take a break from the human video game character that we are to our true self, which is the true player, which is the thing that has free will, simply by sensing your own self-awareness and realizing that light, that aliveness, is common to everything ultimately at the very base level. Okay, so that's a practice that you can do every day for that higher part of your being. Okay. Now, if you go one step below that, we're talking now about the higher levels of the soul, the layers that interface this higher spirit with the physical body. And that's what a lot of mystics would call, the astral body. But the way they describe it is that the astral body is a part of your soul that has to do with emotions and passions and drives and the way you react to things, like the way you perceive emotionally something, okay? So that part of your being, emotions, as we know, there are many different kinds of emotions, many different kinds of feelings, and some are more positive and some are more negative. And this whole entire spectrum of emotions, they ultimately end up affecting the lower part of your soul, which is what someone would call the etheric body, which then in turn affects your physical body and your physical environment and your home, ambience and everything like that, okay? So if you want to do something practical at the level of the astral body, the way to deal with that is, so just now we're talking about one exercise, which is sensing the unity in everything. But in order to sense that unity, there isn't too much emotion involved. It's just a matter of being conscious of consciousness itself. Okay, that it's very abstract, neutral.
It's like being aware that you're aware that you exist, that there is existence pulsing through you.
Yeah. Just you're observing the ultimate observer. That's what you're doing when you're doing that. Okay, and that's very neutral. So now, a more practical, like one level down beneath that, would be the astral level, which has to do with emotions and passions and things like that. So now, here, the practical thing you can do is to center yourself emotionally before you step out of bed per day, or just whenever you want during the day. You center yourself emotionally. And what I've been doing lately is, this may not work for everyone, but I'm telling you what I've been doing lately. Yeah. And instead of, going through all these affirmations, like, everything is going great and, my life, whatever, these affirmations, what if you just take a single word like harmony or peace or love or, joy, right? You just take that word and you close your eyes and you center yourself and you just focus on that concept, right? And you feel around it. You feel like, what is that like? What is that feeling like? And at first you might not feel anything, but if you keep it up for 5 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes, whatever, you realize it's almost like magnetizing you to that vibration. You start, it's almost like it's like kindling a fire. It starts to grow. Okay. And what happens when you do that is you're establishing those vibrations within your soul, which in turn is going to affect, your physical body, your physical environment. And here's another subject we can touch on briefly, which we'll definitely do another show on, the subject of reality creation or manifesting.
Yeah, which I'm sure a lot of people are going to be very interested in that. Yeah. And you have, I know, a very scientific bend on this that has to do with all this actual proof of how these different levels affect what you actually manifest in this physical reality. Yeah.
But the reason why manifesting, I don't want to say it's 100% dependent on, but it depends greatly on your emotional vibrations. Like emotions are a strong gateway or key to making it work.
Sure.
And so that's why I say that the second practical thing you can do is to focus, to center yourself emotionally on a positive ideal. Now some people, they might require, thinking of a positive memory or maybe envisioning a positive future. But if you can do it, it helps to just focus on the ideal itself and just kind of dwell on it and meditate on it for, a couple minutes, 5 minutes, 15 if you want. And all it's going to do is it's going to impress those vibrations on your soul, and you're going to start resonating with it. It's like a wine glass that you sing at a certain pitch and it starts vibrating. Well, that's what you're doing when you're doing this exercise.
Okay? Yeah, and I've actually tried what you're talking about of just, let's say, thinking of the word peace, just that. You're not thinking about you being peaceful. You're not projecting some future situation, trying to be in it, or the world love or whatever. And if you really just sit there and focus on it and feel what that quality feels like, it literally puts your entire state of being into that vibration, into that quality. Relatively quickly. It doesn't take that long if it's just a little practice. Just the word itself, because, you know, even words technically have a certain vibration to them, right? And so they're connected to the concept that they're describing. And so, yeah, I think that's a great practice.
Yeah. So what I've been doing lately is before I step out of bed, I think of the word, I start with, you know, harmony, just to just feel like everything is is harmonious. And I do that for about a minute. Then I move on to peace. And then I move on to, you know, joy, and even to things like profoundness or amazement or wonder. You know, all these different awesome qualities. These are all qualities that are, they exist in a person who is very much in touch with their true consciousness. With the true consciousness is expressing through a person, those are the qualities and the feelings that they're going to have. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what you can do at the second level, which is the emotional level. Now, if you go one step beneath that, now we're talking about the etheric level, and that has more to do with life force itself, more with just pure life force energy and vitality and health. Like, for example, a plant. Okay, a plant doesn't have too many thoughts, as far as I can tell. They don't really have too many thoughts, but they do exist and they are alive. I mean, they are the very definition of aliveness. Like, if you think about something being rich with life, you think about verdance, you know, like verdant forests and everything like that. So your body itself can benefit from having more of this etheric energy, you know. And one way to do that is through breathing techniques. And I know that's something that you were trying out recently. You know, there's things like the Wim Hof method of breathing, which is amazing. Okay.
Yeah, I highly recommend people research that Wim Hof method. Very powerful, but there's many others. There's called holotropic breath work. There's so many different types of breath work, but it does essentially bring this vital force to the body. And I've been feeling, whenever I do that, I do it daily, but right after I do that, I just so much more energy coursing through my veins. And I feel, and it affects actually the higher level you're talking about, affects the emotional even. It's not just pure physical vitality. It actually makes you just feel better, as far because there's so much oxygen getting into the brain and all that too.
Yeah, so that's an important point. So when we are talking about the subtle energy body being an interface between the spirit and the body, it's not just for the spirit to influence the body, it's also for the body to support the spirit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
both hand in hand.
Yeah. Okay. So because imagine, I mean, let's say that you're a free spirited person, right? You just want to move, you just want to do cool things, but your legs are shackled to a big ball of iron. Yeah. You can't get too far, right? Because the physical can impede some of your spiritual intentions.
Sure.
And so, you know, that's a pretty crude example, but what it means is that if you don't have enough life force energy within you, and you have a very unbalanced diet, for example, or everything like that, that can actually act as an impediment to your spiritual expression. So that's why helping things at the bottom level can definitely work itself upwards and support positive spiritual things,
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. In the past, I actually used to almost disregard the physical because it was all about the spiritual. But then I realized that, well, I mean, the spiritual, fine, that's maybe who I truly am at the root, at the cause level, right? And it is limitless and it's beautiful and it's peaceful. But at the same time, that whatever I truly am is choosing to experience itself as this for now, right? And as this, there's a lot of filtering processes, there are a lot of purposeful limitation down to get to experiencing life as this. So if I'm not taking care of this, if there isn't that vital energy force, that if the subtle energy field is not healthy, let's just say, and vibrant, like you were talking about, that actually limits the expression of that spirit side, and even limits the evolution of the soul that is making its way back in a certain way up to experiencing itself as that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because as we talked about earlier, the physical body is it's a filter for the infinite spirit that you're plugged into. Okay, it's a filter, so it channels you down. And so the weaker the body is, and the more I guess biologically disabled it is, weak, tired, whatever like that, the more constricted that pinpoint in the lampshade, the less of your actual light can shine through. And the easiest way to prove that to yourself is to, for example, well, besides the breathing method, which can really charge you up, the easiest one actually is just getting more sleep or taking a power nap. It's amazing. Like, before I did the show, I was kind of tired. I had a lot of stuff to do today, but I took a power nap for 18 minutes. And afterwards, I was so clear. I was like so energized, and I was more my true self. Okay. And if I did not take that nap, maybe I wouldn't be as, clear and energetic as I am right now. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, because sleep is the body's natural way of recharging itself from the pool of subtle energy that is, cosmically available to it.
Yeah. So even that is even something that we take for granted. That's obvious. When we take a nap, we feel better. There's a reason why. It's because it actually refills that subtle energy field that animates the body, that vital force inside, that then allows you to connect to these higher levels in easier ways. So basically, a lot of times when people are doing spiritual work, if they are neglecting the physical, it just makes it harder. It's not impossible. Obviously, you can still have a full spiritual awakening without it, but it's just kind of more challenging to plug into that higher level if on the lower level you're not doing some things to help it. And even just, I want to put this out there, you could have a lot of physical issues, by the way. You could have, you could be very sick or something, but there's always something you can do to I guess, like just a breathing mechanism. Anyone, even if they're very sick, can do some breath work to increase a vital flow to help that connection easier. It's not that, doesn't mean that you can't connect to higher. Obviously you can. Sometimes, someone, for instance, Ram Dass, who some people know, I mean, in the end, he had a complete stroke, and that actually helped. So on the physical level, he was almost completely debilitated, but that actually helped him turn inwards because it shut out the whole world and allowed him to get much more still and go inside. So I'm not saying that, you need to be super healthy as a person to be able, obviously you can be, quite unhealthy and still have a very deep spiritual connection, but you can always help it along with certain practices.
Yeah. It's a question of how much you want to embody your spirit here within physicality. Okay. If you really want to express yourself, in your fullest here, then yeah, you do have to be vitally charged. You do have to be healthy. But if you just want to transcend the ego, if you just want to connect with your higher self, and if the physical body is a distraction, then at that point, I mean, that's why people who are on death's door with near-death experiences, they have these amazing spiritual experiences, because the body is no longer filtering the true self. Okay. So it depends on your goal. Do you want to be here more, or do you want to be here less to return more to your true?
Sure. And that's kind of why some people will spend 20 years in a cave meditating, and they are probably in full unison with that, but they're not in the world. So I guess that it all depends on your objective. Do you feel intuitively you are here to embody the qualities of the higher self and bring them into the world, which is interactions with others, more love, more kindness, your energy field spreading to others, affecting others positively, having change in the world? Or do you want to kind of withdraw and just connect to that yourself? Now, I would say that, and I'm going to put this out there, that it's actually rare, and I've discussed this with some people who were let's just say at that level of full embodiment, and it's actually quite rare that someone would feel intuitively called on to completely withdraw from the world and to really just connect and kind of forget about the physical. I'd say the vast majority of us, our soul's purpose, or what spirits wants to actually do here, is to embody itself in this form, especially at this critical time in the world and in the transition that Earth is going through. And so I would just kind of put a note of caution out there that sometimes if you feel like, well, I just want to withdraw and just meditate and all that, and I've experienced this, it can sometimes be an escape to dealing with the challenges of embodying this into the physical, which is actually a lot of times not easy, but that's where your biggest spiritual growth can occur. So I wanted to make sure to put that out there.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Yeah, because so many people forget they forget that, right? And
Yeah.
it's easy to swing from one imbalance to another kind of imbalance.
Sure, of course, yeah.
You know, like some people, they get so focused on bodybuilding or just, you know, physical health, and
Yeah.
crazy diets,
Yeah.
that they forget all about, you know, the whole spiritual side of things, right?
Yeah.
And vice versa.
And
Yeah.
vice versa. Some people are purely on the spiritual and forget about the physical. So what we're trying to here to do is bring balance. That's why we wanted to discuss all these levels with you guys, so you understand how these things actually interrelate, how each of them have their own importance, and how kind of unifying them and working on all the levels can really help you in your life. So I think those practices that you mentioned are actually great. I'm glad you kind of went level by level.
Yeah, and you can actually combine them into one exercise. Like I've been experimenting. Okay. Yeah, for example, see, this is something that, okay, well, I'll just go through it. So what I do now is, let's say I'm feeling a little bit tired, okay? So I lie down, I set my watch to 18, 20, 25 minutes for the timer. And I can do this in any order, but let's say I start with a power nap, okay? So I just kind of relax, breathe naturally, you know, start nodding off a little bit. And what that does then is that charges me with vital energy, okay? So I feel more awake. So now I wake up out of that, but I'm still in bed. And with that vital energy now, I can so much more easily get into the state of harmony and peace and positivity. Okay, so then I focus on that for 5-10 minutes. Okay, so now I charged up my etheric body with vital energy. So now I'm moving on to the astral, and I'm, you know, impressing positive emotional vibrations into it. And once I'm feeling that centered, then I move on to the highest of all, which is sensing my own liveness and in unity with all life. And that leads to a natural sense of gratitude, which then feeds back into the positive feelings, which makes me feel more alive. So this awesome positive feedback loop that happens. And it was all kicked off by taking just a really short power nap, which uses the body's natural mechanism to, you know, charge itself up with etheric energy. And if you want to, you know, if you want to throw in some Wim Hof breathing, you know, at some point in there, now you've got multiple avenues of charging yourself up. So that's something you can give it a try and see if it works for you.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think it kind of speaks to experimenting with what works for you, having an understanding of each of these levels like we've been talking about today, and just choosing to try things out. I've been, you know, seeing kind of similar things that you're talking about, where just a little power nap, for instance, does wonders, and I instantly can feel the higher state of consciousness so much easier. Sometimes if I'm tired, just some breathing puts me back into that higher state. You know, so sometimes it's as simple as reading something deeply profound or inspirational that can just kick it. So, I mean, you got to experiment with what does it for you, build in little routines, combine things. They can be short, they can fit into your daily life, but they're super powerful and super helpful on many different levels. And then, of course, when all these levels are working together, that just naturally changes your behavior and changes your life. That's how it occurs from the inside out.
Yeah, and that's why we try to take this holistic approach, this whole system approach here at SoulHub. Yeah, because if you focus on only one thing, then you're missing out on the synergetic benefit that comes from everything kind of reinforcing everything else. Yeah,
exactly. And just for you guys who haven't heard of this, Wim Hof is he's called the Iceman. You might want to just go put the Iceman in Google. It's you know, intense, his breathing method. There's other breathing methods, so you could, if you don't resonate with that one, you could kind of look online and just look at, you know, conscious breath work. That's a good term to look up, because there's so many different methods, and experiment and see what works for you. But they can, again, have a profound impact on your, not only your health, but your energy, your subtle energy, and then all the way up to your spiritual, emotional, all these things all combined. So yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. So, you know, what's the benefit of knowing these things in your life, right? I mean, what's the ultimate takeaway from what we've discussed so far? And for me, it's simply to know that there's something more than this life. You know, that we are more than what we see in the mirror. Okay.
Yeah.
And we also know now that there is scientific proof for this otherness, this other greater part of us, you know, our energy fields and everything beyond physicality. Because, you know, sometimes if you forget all the spiritual stuff and you get so dragged down into just a material world, it can be a real drag. And the reason why it drags you down is because we are not just physical beings. Okay. And if you don't come up for air and reconnect with, you know, and recharge your non-physical parts, you're going to almost like spiritually suffocate in a way. And that, you know, it takes a long time. It might take decades, but a lot of times people, they end up feeling almost like hollow shells of their former selves, because because they've been deprived of that air, you know, that spiritual air and light that gives them animation, right? So that's why doing something every day, like for example, you know, the combination exercise I just mentioned, is something that can always keep you topped up, you know, so you can always be your best self.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think you know, that's like you said, that's kind of the whole idea of why we wanted to create SoulHub, but even this community is to give people this this way to not get sucked into just the physical part of the whole illusion and forget these deeper parts, because it gets so hard. Even if you know all this, if you just let yourself go just a few days or a week or a couple weeks or more, just so sucked into your everyday life and the work and the bills and the kids and all that, and forget about all this, it really, that vital force gets sucked down. You lose that connection with the higher self, with the spirit core, and that's what creates lack of fulfillment, unhappiness, lack of peace, and then conflict and relationships and so forth and so forth. So that's why it's good to continually connect with these things, to remind yourself to listen to talks like this, to actually do practical stuff, and you know, then you're always connected in a way, and then you're always benefiting your life from that perspective. So that's really good. Tom, I want to thank you for all your scientific knowledge, which is, I know, a product of a couple decades worth of research. So I appreciate that. And as always, I want to encourage you guys to ask questions. There might be a lot of questions here because we covered some, you know, some complex subjects, some scientific stuff. You might have things you want to get clarification on. Just feel free to give your comments or feedback or your direct questions beneath this video. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we will catch you next week in the next dynamic class. Take care.